So, what I'm going to go through here is a distillation of what we were talking about in terms of the archetype of Lefty Grove and the spiritual ascent from the mines. But we're going to take it all the way because you have three people here: Lefty Grove to the left, Stan Coveleski in the middle, Ed Walsh on the far right. And what these three figures represent is a very specific nexus in place and time, which is the Rust Belt and the Appalachian in the early 1900s. Through coal mining towns, Coveleski and Walsh, Walsh being an Irish immigrant, Coveleski being a Polish immigrant, these are immigrants' children who are working in these coal mines, right? So with Coveleski's experience, he is working. Let's grab a drink here. He is working 12 plus hour days, making under $1 in these coal mines. As a child, as one of the breaker boys, right? They're breaking up coal. Ed Walsh does something similar in his teenage years in one of the roughest mines in the country, I believe in Plains, Pennsylvania. These are anthracite coal mines. So as you can see, I'm going to show you a couple of images here. Here's one of the mining plants in Pennsylvania. Here's another image of the children actively working, right, breaking up coal. And here's one of the entrances to the mines. So what I'm going to elucidate here is there is a metaphysical architecture of initiation, which is the descent into hell, the trial, the transformation, and then the ascent. Okay? So this is something that's present throughout mythological traditions around the world. You have Inanna in the Sumerian. Then you have Persephone in the Greek. These are all, these figures descend into hell. They undergo a profound transformative process, which often involves suffering and isolation. And then they rise up from hell in this profound experience of the transformed, or the one who has mastered this initiatory process. And so the metaphor being this underground cavern, which was often used in these initiation rites, is going beneath the earth, going into the earth. It's a metaphor for the spirit entering the body, right? So when you have these figures, and I'm zoning in on Coveleski because it's so important. He was born in Shamokin, Pennsylvania, and he labored from age 12 deep in these mines. And he would 6 days a week, all day, 12 plus hour shifts, making less than $1 a day. And then he would leave these mines at the end of the day, and he would go and practice pitching by throwing rocks at a tin can that was wedged between tree branches. He was eventually discovered by a semi-pro team, a local semi-pro team called Lancaster, and then from there discovered by Connie Mack and the Oakland Athletics. Or no, sorry, not the Oakland Athletics, the Philadelphia Athletics. So what I'm trying to elucidate here is these initiatory myths have long been present in human history, and they've been elucidated in mythological or religious terms, even in terms of when you look at Christ and Lazarus, right, as figures who go into this darkness or the depths of darkness, which is death, which is a cave, which is etc., right? And they undergo this transformative experience. You're looking at a moment in time in human history where time and place, the industrialization, the rapid industrialization of America, which creates these coal mining towns out of necessity to fuel and power the industrialization of an entire emerging world power, which again, through World War I and World War II, just scales and scales and becomes this massive force. You're witnessing that economic and social intersection with the cultural intersection of baseball as America's pastime, its most powerful cultural export, and its most powerful cultural product. You combine those two, And you get these figures like Grove or Coveleski or Walsh, who are born in these small coal towns in the Appalachian, in the Rust Belt, and they rise to mastery through throwing rocks, right? This practice of throwing rocks that creates, for Coveleski, he would say, he would later say, I was throwing rocks at tin cans and created such a mastery of control that when I stepped onto the big league field with Babe Ruth or Lou Gehrig, the home plate itself in the strike zone was massive because I was so used to throwing rocks at this little tin can, right? So you have this rise that happens through a very specifically inhuman industrial circumstance, where these young children, right, through child labor at this period of time in human history, are laboring in these deep, dark mines. And this is going to be the life and death, period, right? And what is availed is this possibility of like spiritual ascension through the cultural technology of baseball. And that's what's so interesting here about this mediation, is that the industrial technology of the mines itself, in juxtaposition with the cultural technology of baseball, creates a sort of ladder or sort of extension through which there's a profound spiritual initiation that happens. You can see that through the descent as a child into this dark dirt of these coal mines, and the rise to becoming one of the greatest pitchers of all time, which all three of these men have in common, right? Grove, Coveleski, and Walsh are all renowned as some of the greatest pitchers in baseball history. Coveleski pitches 3 complete game wins in the 1920 World Series after the death of one of his teammates and the death of his wife. So you look at these figures and what is created through them, and you can look at the body as a sort of alembic or theater or center for transformation of the spirit, right? Which is our psychology, which is the way we view the world, which is our perspective, our experiences, whether that's pleasure and pain or suffering or triumph or trial, whatever it is. And you can see how these cultural institutions, both of this massive industrial push for mining and factory, as well as the cultural institution and technology of baseball, create an ability for the soul to transform. It's almost like a ladder, right? Or a jungle gym of sorts that is incredibly laced with extreme spiritual difficulty. And you see this ascent and this mastery and this very profound transformation that happens for each of these pitchers here, for each of these people. And again, I just want to show you, right, the vision of the entrance to hell, or the entryway to hell. This is common across all civilizations and all cultures. This vision is literally, it usually is just a cavern, a hole in the ground, and you travel into this hole in the ground, and you experience the substratum of existence, the darkness, the infinite, the void. And so what you have is this sort of paradox of this void, of this loss, of this darkness, of this cavern of toil in an abyss, or almost a penal penalty, or a prison culture, effectively, of suffering for these young immigrant children. Coveleski leaves these mines at the end of every day and practices throwing rocks at tin cans. He's like building a garden, like a spiritual garden in the void for mastery and discipline. We talked about this in relation to Lou Gehrig in one of the previous episodes, which is a baseball as a technology for spiritual evolution. The discipline, the repetition, the routine, the cultivation of mastery. So Waite Hoyt, one of the great pitchers for the Murderers Row Yankees, talks about pitching itself as a craft. It's less of an art and more of a craft, because you're working with the raw materials of each pitcher's potential, and you're honing it through trial and error and cultivation. It's more like sculpture. I brought up that Michelangelo quote. I saw the angel in the marble, and I carved to set it free. And I don't think it's a mistake that each of these men that we're discussing here is a pitcher, a world-class pitcher, because You are working with the physical toil, the labor of the body in these coal mines, and they're perfecting this craft. It's this craft of isolation. It's almost an existential craft of solitary perfection in the art and craft of pitching, right? This is something they don't need anyone throwing to them to practice hitting or anything like that. They are throwing rocks, right? In their spare time. This is such a skeletal process of becoming that is availed through this experience, and it's almost too profound to put into words, because they're living and dying in these mining towns that are entirely dedicated to the practice of mining. And in the midst of all of this, as baseball is becoming the biggest cultural product of importance in American history, these mining towns they're essentially being sacrificed to the process and progress of America's industrial ascent. So in a larger national sense, there's this mythological sacrifice that's occurring. So you can see in modern America, these coal towns, these mining towns, these factory towns, now that the labor has been exported out of them, this labor has been outsourced for a large part internationally, because it has become cheaper for the owners of these companies and corporations to do so. You can see how there is this outrage and this wondering what has happened, right? Because these towns were the lifeblood of America for really the entirety of the 1900s. Steel, coal, cars, right? Manufacturing and mining, factory work were all domestic. This was product of the United States. These are entire epicenters of culture and community, and you have these people, right? You have Grove, Coveleski, and Walsh, all of whom are participating in this profoundly, I would say, inhuman industrial culture of doing something that's radically different than a sort of natural rhythmic process of interacting with the earth, right? Where you have farmers like Walter Johnson or Dizzy Dean or Charlie Gehringer. You're working with the cycles. You're working with the birth and cultivation of animals. This is something that's very tied to nature, the natural process of humanity. But instead, you have this very inhuman, mechanical, industrial process that sprouts at this period of time in human history, especially in America, through the coal mines, that these children are participating in, right? Because there's no law against them doing so, and they need money to survive, right? Their families need money to survive. So you have this from a very young age, right? 12 years old, Stan Coveleski is working in these mines, and he cultivates and practices that craft. That is perhaps the deepest descent narrative that is available to us, because of just how striking and piercingly real it is. So I brought up Inanna and I brought up Persephone as representations of that underground myth of initiation, where they literally travel into the earth, travel into hell to be stripped and transformed of their previous identity, and they rise from that with a newfound, deepened understanding of truth, the spirit, reality. I brought up those myths because I think it's very important. It brings us back to that initial point that we discussed, that baseball itself is actually a spiritual technology that allows for the realization of these mythological and spiritual concepts, which were previously realized in psychological initiations, which would be rough approximations. They'd be like symbolic trials that would be presented by the priestly class of these civilizations and these cultures, whether that's Egypt or Greece or Sumeria, right? We're actually now looking at a very different mode, where historical, technological, physical forces are almost conspiring in an American sense to realize these myths of transformation, these spiritual myths of transformation. And if you think about the spiritual power or force or reality that is behind and contained in someone like Stan Coveleski or Ed Walsh or Lefty Grove, what you're looking at is a full spectrum experience of reality that is almost too profound to articulate, because it's so grounded in experience. There's no real way that you could sum it up. Coveleski's story is in Glory of Their Times by Lawrence Ritter. He actually tells his story, right? And you can get a glimpse of that. But I think the real question is like, how could you possibly sum it up, right? Even in his words, right? Because it's something that's beyond language. It's like a spiritual transformation. It's like the creation of a diamond from coal, right? Literally, right? The creation of that through pressure and through transformation. It's almost something that exceeds translation. So here's his story as he tells it. Well, the semi-pro team in town heard about me being so good throwing stones at tin cans, and they asked me if I'd like to pitch for them. That was in 1908 when I was 18. Of course, maybe being Harry's kid brother had something to do with it too. Harry Coveleski, one of the great pitchers of the dead ball era as well. Then, before I knew what hit me, I was signed to a contract with Lancaster, and I was out of those damn mines for good. Never forget leaving home for the first time to go play with Lancaster. It was the first time I ever rode on a train. Had to get a new suit of clothes to go off to the big city, but was too bashful to buy it. So Mom and Dad went to town, picked one out, and brought it home to fit on me. Then when I got to Lancaster, I was too shy to eat in the hotel with the rest of the team. I'd go to a hot dog stand and eat by myself instead. Paid for it out of my own pocket. After a couple of weeks, some of the players got suspicious, never seeing me around. So one day they followed me and caught me eating my hot dogs. After that, they made me go to the hotel dining room with them. I pitched for Lancaster for a few years, then went up for a trial with the Athletics late in 1912 with Connie Mack. Connie Mack was a good manager. He was a very considerate man. And then he goes on to say Connie Mack called him and told him he was to start his first big league game. So you can see here, it's the literal aspects of the story that he's telling. He's retelling his history and his past. But what we miss a lot of the time in history and in culture, as well as specifically American history and baseball history and culture, is that we're missing this very profound thread of spiritual transformation, which is so difficult to articulate. And this is so much of what this project is about, because when you look at this from an architectural, kind of architectonic spiritual perspective, there's so much here that's not said and not being said in terms of this descent into hell and this rise into mastery, right? Cultural mastery, civilizational mastery, through craft, through the devotion to craft and technique, which, as I said before with that Lou Gehrig essay, is the spiritual technology and architecture that baseball actually avails as a physical practice, as a discipline, as a honing of a craft. And that in itself, through its physicality, through its, especially pitching, through the physicality, through the psychology, through this full body, holistic spectrum practice of the art and craft of pitching, actually avails this spiritual wealth to emerge, which is actually often mirrored by physical wealth, right? Where they've crafted this ability within themselves. There's actually a Meister Eckhart quote, who is a Christian theologian and mystic. He says, all of the inner gold is all that is manifest in the outer gold, and vice versa. And what he means by that is that inner spiritual cultivation is always mirrored by the external product, and vice versa. There is no ability to distinguish that. And so when you see these three men here, Grove, Coveleski, and Walsh, what you're really looking at is someone who has been spiritually transformed in this inner furnace of turmoil and suffering and confrontation that formed the early childhood growing up in these Rust Belt towns, right? These Appalachian coal mining towns, laboring in the mine shafts for less than $1 a day for 12 plus hours every day, -1, right? 6 days a week. You're looking at a moment in American history, which is a communal, collective, historical moment, right? A moment of profound psychological transformation, especially in the Rust Belt, especially in the Appalachian. But you're looking at the full, like this full realization, this full spectrum realization of the potential latent within that movement and that moment in coalition with the cultural product of the civilization that these mines are building. This is the fuel, right? This is the energy. This is the primordial energy being dug up from the center of the earth to feed this burgeoning civilization. And Grove, Walsh, and Coveleski are part of this work in an active sense. And so you see them actually climb the cultural scaffolding of this emerging civilization and empire, which is itself its own memory, its own um, figuration of self. They go from this deepest, darkest cavern of existential spiritual isolation and struggle to the heights of this civilization and this culture as markers of greatness, right? Each of them is remembered as one of the best pitchers of all time. So again, to return to this image of the sort of mouth of hell or the gates of hell as one of these mines in Pennsylvania. It looks like this one's Brooks Mine. I pulled this from one of the articles I found on mining towns in the Appalachian. This is what the real descent ascent is. The real descent ascent in a spiritual sense is actually availed through this practice of mining as a industrial, mechanized, almost inhuman form of suffering and struggle and turmoil, which actually creates the foundational backbone of an entire civilization as a modernized industrial superpower, right? It's the fire, it's the coal, it's the energy, it's the heat, it's the real thermodynamic power behind the machine that is America, right? So you have these men who are tasked with, as children, descending into this huge kind of mouth of the earth and dredging up the fire, right? The primordial fire from the depths of the earth to feed to this civilizational mouth. And then what happens is they cultivate this technique, they cultivate this skill, they cultivate this discipline outside of the mines, and it actually creates a method for them to emerge, and to not only emerge but to ascend, to accomplish, to empower, to achieve these great heights, which is they are now right enshrined in these gold plaques in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Each of them with a very distinct pitching style, which I think itself emerges from this existential confrontation that happens in their early childhoods. This is incredibly spiritually profound material, and it's something that I will say I don't think you see or that you find anywhere else, specifically, again, because of the historical circumstances that are emergent at this period of time. So when you look at these men, these figures, right, of course they have great statistics. Of course there's the baseball story. And that's so much of what is being told, right, especially in Lawrence Ritter. This is the story of these people finding realization and self-realization through baseball. But I argue we have to dig much deeper and understand the real historical, political, economic, social, and spiritual contexts to really understand exactly what these people went through, what they experienced, and what is really happening at the transformational level of the self that produces the humanity beneath all of this, right? Because that's the most important thing. So when you look at someone like Stan Coveleski, right, or you look at someone like Lefty Grove or Ed Walsh, you're seeing this deep spiritual fomentation of years and years of this struggle, this turmoil, this effort in these mining towns to create anything or create something that would allow for the emergence of the self in the midst of this incredibly difficult period, prolonged period of suffering and pain and anxiety and uncertainty. You have Coveleski say, and Ed Walsh mirrors this, baseball is a worrying thing, right? And the reason that they say that is their entire experience in baseball is being informed by the memory of the mines. So baseball represents, again, economically, a way out of this situation and a way to create a sustainable kind of laboring force or working force in their lives to create a real life, the possibility of a real life out of this protracted, indefinite laboring contract in the mines for nothing, right? That would keep them there forever. So that's really what we're talking about with the technology of baseball. It's a cultural technology, it's a spiritual technology, it's a physical technology of the empowerment of the self. So you can come into spiritual contact with yourself, especially through the art of pitching, because it's psychological, it's physical, it's a holistic gathering, right? It's a force of will. It's a spiritual force of will. It's the force of the center of will. Again, Ed Walsh pitching something 440 plus innings in one season. This is the creation of a will center, right? A will center of discipline, and these three men here are forged in the epicenter of it, the most inhuman, brutal darkness and blackness of the epicenter of it. They're in the core of the void, the core of the spiritual void that seems unceasing and without end. And from that, they emerge with this fire of will, represented, expressed, and manifest through the cultivation and practice of the art and, as Wade Hoyt would say, craft of pitching. So that's the full fire of what we're representing here. And it's interesting that it's thermodynamic in the way that coal, right, was used to power American empire and is used to power American empire. Coal, oil, right? They're digging into the depths of the earth, into these natural fossil fuels, right? This accumulation of historical sediment. They're dredging that up for the empowerment of an entire civilization, right? An entire epoch, really, the industrialization of the world. But in doing so, they also emerge, right? They also emerge with this deep, deep, deep power, right? They also pull something up from the depths of hell. It's an experience and a confrontation with the void of self in this descent. It's this fire and darkness, this fire and blackness, and in that confrontation and in that contrast, you discover what's real, you discover what's possible, and you discover what is within you. The physical circumstances of these minds, again, I almost can't overstate it enough, is essential to the process because it's a realization of this hellscape. And again, when you hear the experiences of Coveleski and Walsh and the way they describe the minds and how baseball was this almost constant state of anxiety for them, because what it represented was the very thin kind of like slipstream or hold that they had before the descent into the mines. It was the one thing that brought them out of that. You can see that dialectical tension and the pressure there, or the forging of something incredibly profound, right? And to honor that and to see that for what that really is. So that's the episode. I will catch you on the next one, all right?